Hi, I'd like to talk today about a set of verses that are really important to me personally. They're in Luke 22, 31 and 32. We're going to read through them and take them apart sort of piece by piece. So we're going to start in verse 28 to get the context. It's the Last Supper. Jesus is talking to his disciples and he says this, "You are those who have stood by me in my trials. And just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I grant you that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." In other words, he's giving a word of encouragement for his disciples just before the terrible time of the crucifixion happens, because they've stood by him in his trials. And he's saying it will not go unrewarded. But then he turns to Peter and he adds something more, because he knows something about Peter's future that Peter doesn't know. He says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you've turned again, strengthen your brothers." So he singles Peter out and says, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. You're going to go through one of the greatest trials in your life you'll ever face. But I prayed for you that your faith won't fail. And Peter, of course, is supremely confident. He's like, "Sift me like wheat? I'm ready. Bring it on." So he said to him, "Lord, I'm with you. I'm ready both to go to prison and to death." And Jesus is like, "No, you don't understand, Peter." He said, "I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you've denied 3 times that you know me." Now, Peter would have been, I'm sure, shocked to hear that and probably didn't quite believe it, because he didn't feel like he was about to deny Jesus. He felt full of confidence and full of faith. He's sure he's willing to do anything. But a few days later, he would be weeping bitterly because of what he had done. Now, at that point, it's encouraging to see how Jesus, at that point, restores Peter to relationship with himself and how he brings him back to his ministry. But I want to focus today on what he did here in these verses before it ever happened, to encourage Peter and to prepare him ahead of time for the storm that was coming. So let's take this one phrase at a time. First of all, notice just the very beginning, "Simon, Simon." The repetition intensifies it. I can't help hearing this as an outpouring of Jesus' intense, tender concern for Peter. I imagine when I first read this, and at a time when it was really relevant to my life, I almost could imagine Jesus saying to me, Kevin, you're being sifted, but I've prayed for you." And there's something wonderfully personal about this. This is not just an abstract doctrinal thing. This is Jesus caring for his friend and for his disciple whom he loves. But second, this fascinating and mysterious phrase, "Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat." There's so much here to unpack, and I'm not sure I understand most of it. The first thing to notice is it's very strange that it says Satan has demanded permission to sift you. What right does Satan have to demand anything? And the answer is he doesn't, of course. He can demand all he wants, but the Father never has to agree to his demands. This is just him being belligerent. It reminds me of when he went to Job, not to Job, but to God, about Job. Remember, Job was living, God was saying, "Wow, Job's a really good guy. He's living for me. He's doing the right thing. He loves me." And Satan came into God's presence and said, "Yeah, but let me sift him. Let me put him through some intense trials. Let me give him lots and lots of trouble, and you'll see his true colors." So he came to God and sort of challenged him and said, "Let me sift Job and you'll see." And God permitted it. And why did he permit it? Not because he was intimidated by Satan, not because he had to permit it, but because he chose to. So Satan was demanding to sift Job in a way, or at least asking to sift Job. And God was saying, "I'll let you," because God had other purposes. God wanted to use the same sifting that Satan was bringing, but not to destroy Job, but to teach him something much deeper about himself. And I think the same thing is happening here. I think Satan is saying, "I demand to sift Peter," and the Father permitted it. He gave permission. He accepted it. He said, "Yes, I'll let you do that," because he had purposes for the sifting as well. He wanted to bring Peter to the end of his rope. He wanted to take this ultra-confident Peter and say to him, your faith shouldn't rest in what you do for me. Your faith shouldn't rest in how confident you are in your loyalty and your bravery. Your faith should rest in my son. And so he had to let him be sifted. He didn't have to, but he chose to let him be sifted by Satan. But still, it is sort of funny, because Jesus had spent the last 3 years showing everywhere that by casting out demons and all sorts of other things, that he had bound the strong man, Satan, that he had overthrown his kingdom everywhere he encountered it. And we see the victory of Jesus over Satan again and again and again. And yet at this point in Jesus' ministry, as we approach the crucifixion, everything changes for a short historical moment. During the crucifixion, Jesus did not look like he had any power at all. And during that time, Satan demanded to sift his followers as well, and God permitted it. Because it was good for them to be sifted, and because it was the right time in history. Anyway, what's fascinating about this is Jesus says, "I pray for you that your faith may not fail." And that really confused me when I first read it, because I thought, wait a minute, but Peter did deny him. I mean, if I knew that Satan had demanded to sift Peter like wheat by tempting him to deny Jesus, I would have been praying that he'd stand up under the denial. But Jesus knows he's going to deny him. Apparently, he prayed through it and discovered, that's just going to happen. But he says, "I pray for you that your faith won't fail." And I thought, well, how is that not failing? And the thing is that Jesus was praying for the long term. He wasn't just praying that Peter wouldn't fail in the first place, that he wouldn't deny him in the first place. He was praying about what would happen afterwards. Remember the difference between Peter and Judas. Judas betrayed Jesus, and then he went away and hanged himself in remorse. Peter went away and wept bitterly. He may have felt like hanging himself, but he didn't. But he did walk away from the ministry. He went back to his boat and his fishing until Jesus called him back again afterwards and restored him to ministry, restored him to fellowship with Jesus, and they moved on. But right here he says, "I've prayed for you that your faith won't fail." And he means for that moment. He means for the time after your failure, that it won't fail in the long run. He meant that you'll remember afterwards that I still forgive. You'll remember afterwards that I still redeem. You'll remember afterwards that I still save. And you'll recognize that all still holds for you. And that's why he says, when you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. To say when you've turned again implies he's going to turn away for a time. But he says, when you turn again, strengthen your brothers. In other words, Peter, I'm not just forgiving you. I see your life as having a purpose that goes beyond your denial. And when you face this test and fail the test, I have not given up on you. I'm going to bring you back to ministry, and I'm going to take the sifting of your personal failure, and I'm going to use it to help you be a better servant in my kingdom. You're going to have a better understanding of humility and a better understanding of your full forgiveness. And that's the way you're going to be able to be a servant for my kingdom, is as a sifted man. Sometimes I think we go through what we go through, not because God in any way wants us to sin, but because, but we fail the tests. And I think sometimes God still sees the end result, though. He doesn't give up when we give up. He doesn't despair when we despair. He knows the spiritual battle we're facing. He knew we were going to fall before we ever did. But he also knew what came afterwards, and that there's redemption and forgiveness and moving on. And does he pray for us that our faith won't fail? Well, think about what it would be like to know that Jesus had prayed for you personally. Well, I don't know that the Bible exactly speaks of Jesus praying for us now in heaven using that language. But it does definitely share something very similar. It says, for example, that Jesus is our high priest, and that a high priest understands and knows the weaknesses of those he's the priest for. And it says that Jesus intercedes for us at the right hand of the Father. And so there is a strong sense in which Jesus does the same kind of thing as when he prayed for Peter, but he does it for us. He says, I know that Kevin is going to face this test here. I know that he may even fail here, but I'm praying for him. I'm interceding for him. I'm coming to you, Father, on behalf of him, that you would strengthen him afterwards and that his faith would not fail. And he says the same thing in a sense for you. And so that's my encouragement to you today is Jesus, have you run into things that you thought you could handle and it's turned out you haven't? Have you failed God morally in some ways that have left you shattered in your confidence as a spiritual man or woman? Well, that's the sifting. Satan may have meant it to destroy you, but God means it for good. And Jesus has been interceding on your behalf that your faith would not fail. And that in the long run, you would turn again and be able to strengthen those around you and find your own ministry based on the humility and the compassion that comes from having seen your own weakness. and how the strength of God is sufficient for that. So, thanks. See you next week.